Before we hear from a really extraordinary panel, I wanted to just make a few announcements. The first is just to let you know that one gentleman in this audience walked up to the president and offered him $1 million to help with his HIV/AIDS effort. The second is that the president accepted. I've been asked by a large number of you when this will happen again. We're going to have our next Global Philanthropy Forum annual conference in the week of May 14. I don't know which day is in the week of May 14. In Mountain View, California, in 2007, on the Google campus. And so I would like you to join me in thanking Larry Brilliant for making that happen. I've learned that Dr. Brilliant is a man of action, and he never takes, he sees nothing as insurmountable. He's going to make it happen. We will soon all be playing volleyball at the Googleplex. The second is that during the summer, we are going to co-host a summer seminar, which will be 4 days for 25 philanthropists to dig deep and take a look at the values that drive their philanthropy and the ways in which those values are given philanthropic expression. And so if we're going to co-host it with the Aspen Institute, so it'll be in Aspen, Colorado. And so you should let us know if you're interested in taking part. I've also been asked by many of you how the forum is structured. And it is a combination. We've moved to a membership model. We have private foundations that are members, family foundations that are members, individual philanthropists that are members. And we would be there's information on our membership in your packet, and any of us would be delighted to talk to you about that structure if you're interested. I have some people to thank, and I will start with some of our original members to thank them because they helped make this possible, foundation members. The Skoll Foundation is a strategic partner of ours. It's been a truly deep and important relationship. It's not just a financial relationship. They help us think through how to connect social entrepreneurs with you. And so we're very grateful for that. The International Finance Corporation has partnered with us for the first time this year, and you saw the fruits of that last night. Levi Strauss Foundation, the David and Lucile Packard Foundation, the United Nations Foundation, Chevron, the C.S. Mott Foundation, Pierre and Pamela Midyar Foundation Fund, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie, Ford, USAID, and the Peninsula Community Fund. And of course, we got our start from the Hewlett Foundation. I, however, want to especially thank the council team that has kept us moving, kept me standing up for the past 3 days, and have helped make this happen. They are led by one of the most magnificent people I've had the good fortune to work with in my entire career, and that's Susie Antunian. They include Stacy Fish, who's the 6-foot-tall, gorgeous, wonderful human being who you've all gotten to know. Courtney Riggle, Christina Mitra, Greta Peterson, Jessica Wolf, Layla Bozarg, famous Layla, Marguerite Hanley, Payal Dalal, Sarah Malikian, Susana Rodriguez, and Brian Gruber. So please join me in thanking them. And then finally, I'm going to ask something of you, and that is that you help us shape next year's forum and our programming in between, because we have monthly events. by filling out your questionnaire and letting us know how we can do a better job next time around, letting us know what worked, what didn't, and giving us new ideas that we have not thought of. So in that way, please help contribute to the forum. And now join me in welcoming our exceptional final panel, led by Stephen Heintz of Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
His choice.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jane. Jane, in her inimitable fashion, has given us a rather formidable challenge. Can you imagine being asked to be on a panel between Bill Clinton and Wycliffe Jean? I mean, the good news is you're all still in the room, but the bad news is I'm not sure how we're going to make this that interesting.
And we don't dance.
We did all think about putting on our dark glasses, but we decided that we wouldn't perform so well in that character. We do have the great advantage of having four of the most interesting minds in philanthropy represented here on this panel for a conversation about philanthropy, policy, and politics, and where and how we draw those lines. We've talked a lot in the last couple of days about the need for philanthropy to be strategic, to be focused on the great issues of our day. President Clinton just gave us an inspiring speech and a passionate call to action on many of those issues. But philanthropy is in a unique position that we need to guard very carefully and be very protective of. So this relationship between philanthropy and public policy and politics is a sensitive one. And how we think about where the lines are, how we draw those lines, how we recalibrate them from time to time is very important work. So I'm delighted really to have four of the best of my colleagues as foundation presidents with me for this conversation, and we're going to try to keep it very fluid and open. I'm going to pose a few questions, they're going to pose a few questions. We will try to leave some time at the end so that you can also join us in this conversation. With me today are Carol Larson, who is the president and CEO of the David and Lucile Packard Foundation, Vartan Gregorian, the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Sterling Speirn, the, I think we can still say, new president of the WK Kellogg Foundation, and Doug Bereuter, I think we can also still say, the relatively new president of the Asia Foundation. On this panel, you have people who've been involved for quite a few years in philanthropy. You have some, like myself, who've been in it only for a handful of years, and some who are brand new at it, but come, in Doug's case, for example, from a long and very distinguished career in public policy. So we've got just the right mix, I think, to begin this conversation. I'm going to start with what I hope will be a provocative introductory question to get the ball rolling. I think many of you have probably read and discussed in recent years the sort of growing body of literature about the role of foundations in shaping the political discourse in American society. And much of this discussion, much of the literature has been focused on what has been termed the great success of the avowedly conservative foundations in dominating much of the public political discourse in American life in recent years. In a series of recent articles and a forthcoming book, a very bright young political scientist at City College in New York named Andrew Rich has argued that conservative foundations, if we can just accept these labels for the purposes of shorthand, that conservative foundations have been far more effective, in his view, than mainstream or liberal or progressive foundations in waging what he calls the war of ideas. That through massive investments over a sustained period of time, conservative philanthropy has in fact dominated the political discourse about the great challenges before us and the ideas necessary to meet those challenges. Now I wonder, colleagues, how you feel about Mr. Rich's analysis. Is he right? Should philanthropy be engaged in the way that the conservative philanthropies have been engaged, with the purpose of going out to shape the political discourse? Or should philanthropy have a different role? Any volunteers?
Ladies first, no?
Ladies first, good.
Good. I should say that I work with a family foundation. It's 41 years old, but our board consists of family members and non-family members. Our founder was Dave Packard, co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, and his wife, Lucile. Dave was a Republican. He was in a Republican administration, and he was pro-choice. He was also pro-environment, and he was very concerned about Earth's natural systems. Today, I don't think we would identify ourselves as a family foundation as being progressive or not being progressive. We do have a consistency of focus on issues. So when we are confronted with this question about should we be doing more, given that the positions that we take to co-fund and over a sustained period of time with a handful of foundations, what makes most sense for us as an institution is that, first, I think that the critique is right. Many of us haven't had the staying power on the issues or the ideas that we care about. But it also isn't just easily transferable into today's world. There was a handful of small conservative foundations, 20, 30 years ago. It was before the internet, before MoveOn.org, before the Democracy Alliance. We have many more choices, and I think there needs to be a new model. But for a lot of family foundations, I think we'll need to pick and choose our places for involvement. And the key message would be to have that kind of staying power of ideas over a long period of time, where I think we can learn from that, from the conservatives.
Let me extend this point for a moment. Rich's analysis goes another step. He suggests that not only have these very conservative, ideologically conservative foundations really been so successful in dominating the discourse, but he says they've done it because they've been very strategic about how they've organized to do it. And he makes the following three distinctions between how very conservative foundations are organized and how the rest of us behave. First, he says, conservative foundations support a broad-based, ideologically coherent, and multi-issue political program, while mainstream and progressive foundations organize their grant-making in what he calls issue silos. So that's the first distinction. Second, he argues conservative foundations are far more willing to provide long-term general operating support grants to their grantees, while the rest of us give preference to supporting specific, well-defined, discrete projects. And finally, he contends that conservative foundations support an ideology, while mainstream and progressive foundations tend to fund either a more pragmatic, research-based, problem-solving approach, or efforts to make government more responsive through grassroots participation. Are those distinctions important for us to think about? Sterling, you've had experience both in politics and in philanthropy. How do you react to all of that?
As a new CEO, I don't know I should touch this question with a 10-foot pole, Stephen. But let me touch it with a 5-foot pole.
Even better. The closer we get to it, the better it'll be.
Even the way I think it's certainly a legitimate response by some of our colleagues to say we need to get better organized if we're on the other side of the fence from those conservative foundations. But there are other responses. In your question, you said the way they have framed the political discourse. I think I would rather ask, what is political discourse in this country and in the other countries we all work in? You use the term war of ideas. I didn't know that the best democracies work by having wars over ideas. And in most of us who do work, Kellogg's claim to fame or our distinctive competences, grassroots work, like many others in the room, it's from the ground up. The people we work with every day don't debate stem cell research or choice necessarily in their daily lives. They're working on much more common problems. But if they're distracted by the polarization of the spin people on both sides of any issue, discourse just stops. But I think there's some great hope that the appetite, I think, of the American people and in the countries we work in, and I'm sure you see that in the countries you're in, there's still a great appetite among common people to have public conversations. there isn't a lot of opportunity. And measuring civic participation by voting is clearly not good enough. That's one data point. But I think the work of some of the practitioners in the United States, working on deliberation and dialogue and showing amazing results when people have a chance to have discourse, when the spin people and the ideologues are out of the table. That's certainly been our experience in working, say, in Southern Africa. But we know once we work at the ground, we have to link ground local work with ministers, with presidents and others. But we can talk more about that.
Vartan, how at Carnegie, how do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line in terms of the relationship of your philanthropy with political debate, political discourse, political ideologies, and how do you go about that?
Well, I think the study that you mentioned is, forgive me for saying, a little simplistic. Is observations somewhat valid, that if you stay with any cause, invest lots of money to the exclusion of others, you have to demonstrate success. The first most important thing is donor intent. We all have foundations which have missions. In my case, Andrew Carnegie was radical by any standard, even though he was the richest man at the time. Anybody who would say amassing wealth is the worst form of idolatry. The person who dies rich dies disgraced. If I went to this philosophy around the nation, I would be kicked out from this room and any other room. All of you are here because you amassed wealth, because you represent wealth. But he believed it, that with wealth comes public responsibility. And that's why we're here. So Andrew Carnegie was dedicated himself to international peace and understanding. Understanding is not possible without education. Education is not possible with an open market of ideas. If we wanted to teach one ideology, we should have a catechism. I said, you have to come to this result. Any thinking person has to come to the following result. By the same token, it doesn't guarantee that liberals have all the right answers or conservatives. Knowledge, reason, logic, testing, common sense, all of them have to be tested. That's why we believe in common market of ideas, as Justice Frankfurter said when he defended academic freedom. We have to debate freely of ideas. Unfortunately, we don't have the kind of dialogue that is needed in our country, the kind of discourse we need in our country. We've simplified everything to two, almost like a Manichaean philosophy. We have on the television two persons. You represent the left, you represent the right. God knows the United States has other movements, libertarians, socialists, radicals, cooks, whatever you may have. It's not confined, it's not confined to two sides. Every issue does not have two sides. So you have to invest in individuals. We're proud at Carnegie we've invested in this past century all kinds of people. Some have been right, some have been wrong. We have given grants to conservatives, we have given grants to liberals. What I don't like is the attitude that is more and more dominating in our society. And I can tell you this way, our democracy should not be transformed into the kind of thing years ago. I remember an Anglican bishop in a fit of ecumenicity vis-a-vis his Episcopal colleague said, brother, we both serve the Lord, you in your way and I in his. And that's the way the discourse is. We're both Americans, we believe in two-party system, but we consider one party is bad, the other party is not American party. And then we go to the rest of the world, Iraq and elsewhere, so you have to have multi-party system. Whereas in the United States, we denigrate Republican Party or Democratic Party in the heat of campaign. We simplify and dehumanize them, all in the nice old thing. When you talk about something, I wait for you to finish your remarks because I've ready remarks already. There's no dialogue, true dialogue. There's no common vocabulary. There are no common values now gradually. And so everything cannot be reduced to two sides. And frankly, I also don't care whether donor was really generous or not. In Machiavelli's Prince, there is a wonderful line. Whether somebody is real believer or not, it does not matter. Does he act like a good Christian? Whether donor gave out of vanity, out of political thing, tax, whatever incentive. It does not matter. The donor gave, and we have to see it as a fact, as an investment, and we have to see whether properly it's invested for public good. Whether you're conservative, liberal, I don't care. But I do care for the fact there has to be transparency, accountability, and not to smuggle things under different headings in order to push an agenda. So if there is dialogue, there should be dialogue. Debate, there should be debate. But not the kind of thing that we're doing, namely, I supported a movement that is going to lead to the following conclusion. Then it provides incentive for others to do that. But what happens to marketplace of ideas? If conservatives have good solution for schools, for environment, so be it. It should be tested on common sense, on science, on logic, reason, be accepted. Test, the proof is in the pudding. We cannot just discuss theoretical divisions and then dehumanize each other. And then liberals, by the way, I also don't like the following. I'm one of the people who said to a person, I see your point of view. Because all liberals think somebody whom they talk to has a point of view. And my colleague said, oh, thank you for seeing my point. I don't see any point of yours. So that kind of dialogue is bad also when you concede something and it's considered a sign of weakness because there's no reason to a dialogue.
Doug, you had a very distinguished and long career in the United States Congress. And I wonder, from the perspective of a politician, a policymaker, somebody who's got to make the decisions, what did philanthropy provide to you?
Well, first of all, let me say that my impression about the professor's conclusions, his theses, is basically that he's accurate. But I think it's important to remember that public policy, including public policy for philanthropy, is set by a political process, by legislative bodies at all levels, by administrators, by regulators, by executives. And I think that philanthropic organizations, including public charities, and I think I represent the only public charity among the foundations here, have to be very careful about the line between policy and politics. So we have at the Asia Foundation additional restraints imposed upon us because about 12 to 14% of our funds come from a direct appropriation from Congress. So we're very conscious of where certain key legislators have their interests, the areas where they would not want us to be working. But I think that philanthropic organizations have been conservative, that is, reluctant, to try to use their legitimate role to influence public policy. They have imagined lines against lobbying where they don't exist in some cases. It is very important that you respect those statutory lines, but I think it would be well if public charities generally, foundations generally, religious organizations generally would go back and look at the Lobby Reform Act of 1974, which was finally implemented 1976, 14 years later, finally got out of the bureaucracy, and to see what the real restraints are. There's much more flexibility for legitimately lobbying, influencing public policy, whether or not you're a registered lobbyist or you're not registered under that 76 Act. Might also look, if I could put in a plug for an organization which I have no contact, at the private sector's guidelines for nonprofit organizations on lobbying, 1999. I think then it would give boards of directors, their staffs, people who are donors, much more interest in becoming involved in trying to set public policy. And I think philanthropic organizations need to look hard at protecting their roles in our society today. Post 9/11, a number of things have happened which could impose restraints on grant making, which are probably not in the public interest and not necessarily important for protecting us against terrorist organizations. So I think I would have liked to have seen a greater impact of philanthropic organizations, including public charities, on the process that goes on in Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm. I think you made an extremely important point that we fund, many of us, a lot of advocacy work. But we don't participate necessarily in advocacy ourselves, even when we have gained a lot of knowledge because of the good and hard work that our grantees are doing. They're producing knowledge and ideas and models. And I'm not sure I'm looking at my own foundation, I'm not sure we do enough to help advocate for those models and ideas as they've been proven and tested in the way that you talked about, Vartan.
Yeah, I agree. I did not mean to imply that what we do does not have impact on public policy. It does indeed. When we promote understanding, when we bring Soviet generals in the past and American generals together, or now Russian generals and American generals together, there's a purpose. We're trying to build bridges between the two camps, because diplomats get to know each other, generals don't get to know each other usually. When we bring Aspen Institute to study Russia, where Doug was participant, or China, or Islam, and bring congressional leaders and scholars together for 5 days, intensely studying and a matter, we're trying to educate and influence, of course, not particular solution, but the whole idea that the problem exists. When we have taken 7 cities in order to deal with the issue of that district level school reform is possible, high school reform is possible, not school by school, but the whole system. We're trying to influence and demonstrate, of course. When we do voting registration, we provide largest amount of money, voter registration. We are influencing public policy. When we are doing, for example, also campaign finance reform on state level, we are influencing public policy. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you have one solution you like to push through Congress for that conclusion. And Doug is right that we have a process. Whether the other side, whatever the other side is, has the arguments to contend with, that's another issue. I think the issue is to what extent our different grants create public pressure, public policy, and we are all influencing it. Whether we have single solution or dual solution or multiple solution, it's open to discussion, or we know what the result is and we're going to say this is what has to happen. That's a major issue. In my opinion, that second one is prerogative of congressmen to accept or not. That's not even the problem. The problem is whether we have open discussion, whether you have partners to discuss, coherent way, long-term, civil manner in which you educate the public, educate decision makers, rather than use loudspeakers to drown your opponents and others who you don't agree.
Carol?
Or can you hear me?
Do I need to use this separate mic, or
Across the
Just
way?
you, Doug.
So
Just you.
I'd like to affirm what Vartan's saying in terms of a very important role of philanthropy to be a forum for ideas and discussion. And in answer to the question about when does it go too far, right? For me, I think it goes too far if you don't start out with a discussion of ideas, and if philanthropy doesn't start out with a question about what are the best ideas. But then I really believe that philanthropy has both an opportunity and a responsibility to move beyond that discussion of ideas and vetting of conflicting opinions, and to actually move ideas to action. Not everyone has to do it, but foundations have the right to do it, and they have the means to do it, and you can do it legally, and there's a difference between advocacy and lobbying, and I think most everyone in the audience knows that. But there are really some clear-cut rules about the difference between the two, and foundations can't lobby, but we can advocate. And I would say that it's an incredibly important part of our philanthropic sector that there are foundations who want to move beyond the discussion of ideas into action, hopefully well-grounded in science and evidence and in a debate and dialogue. So just the final thing I would say is we have a number of areas that the Packard family and its governing board of the foundation have believed to be important over these 40 years. And in each one of them, we've found it really takes a tool of, tool set, tool chest from discussion of ideas to strategic communication to advocacy to investment to organizing to constituency building to funding organizations who do lobbying with our general support money. So I think there's room for all of this, but I wanted to both affirm the exchange of ideas, but also to say ideas to action is another really important role for philanthropy.
Absolutely. I want to, in a minute, I want to take us into the international domain, but while we're still thinking about the relationship to the U.S. political and public policy process, Doug, you mentioned the Patriot Act as one thing that may have had some chilling effect on global philanthropy from American sources because of the new requirements related to anti-terrorism finance. Foundations in the nonprofit sector more broadly, of course, have come under increasing scrutiny in Congress in the last few years. There have been hearings, there's been legislation proposed, there have been a lot of stories in the press of some cases of really unfortunate and terrible abuse, but they are happily a small number of cases that get a lot of publicity. Has this had a chilling effect? Does this discourage any of you from being more active in what you just described, Carol? Are we containing our voices more? Are we being less risk-taking in what we fund? Are we not being the advocates that perhaps we should be because of this political environment?
Well, I don't want to keep, but
No, go ahead.
I think it's really important to think of ourselves as a sector. You know, I remember John Gardner describing to me the formation of the independent sector and how he actually held out his hands and said it was going to be a forum with all kinds of positions, political partisanship positions represented in it, but it was a place that you'd share something in common. And the one really interesting piece of this whole response to the congressional hearings, I think, has been that people who very much disagree on the issues agree on the role of the sector. And so whether it be conservative foundations or whatever label we want to put on it, I think we do have to hang together in terms of believing in the right of philanthropy and the need for the country to move and be engaged in the policy process. So I guess I think there has been a little bit of a chilling effect, but I think there's been a hope because it has brought people together who disagree on issues but agree on the role of philanthropy.
The one thing that's disappointed me in all candor about this period in which we've had this increased scrutiny and a lot of discussion about the role of the sector is that we've ended up focusing on the narrow issues, the very technical issues about the 990 form and the type 3 supporting organizations and all of these very technical things, and we haven't yet raised the level of this discussion to the vitally important role of the nonprofit sector in modern democracies and what the nonprofit sector represents for the vitality and health and great strength of this country. And we really need to elevate that debate, I think.
Let me just mention one thing which many of you may not know. We have 1.4 million nonprofit organizations in the United States. 1 out of 10 or 11 Americans work for a nonprofit organization. We talk about $350 billion business in many ways. So we are a major force.
Absolutely.
And I agree with you. We have never studied the impact of this force in the United States. What started as volunteer associations that Alexis de Tocqueville noticed in 1835 has grown into this business. Just for one illustration, more people work now for higher education than automobile, textile, steel, and few industries combined. But we never look at it that way. And it's not a charitable content, it's a philanthropic content. Because, and this sector, by the independent sector, also interacts with the government. Most of our museums, most of our libraries, our theaters, artistic, are supported by nonprofit sector. Most of our hospitals are supported by nonprofit sector. So this aspect of it, Steve, you're right. Coming to international domain, it stresses the fact also we have to keep our integrity and independence. Otherwise, we'll be seen as agents of whatever United States government at that time happened to be in foreign countries, that we're conduits of an official policy abroad. And that will make our task, long-term impact, less. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that independence of foundations and their accountability and transparency is important, So when we try to, you like argued it in Indonesia, it's not seen American government's foreign policy objective. It's seen as a long-standing Asia Foundation commitment to the region. Because when I grew up, there are two institutions. I was born in Iran, Tabriz. Two institutions were venerable: American education, American hospitals. There were no question. Philanthropy, American philanthropy, nobody questioned. How many people you converted to Christianity was irrelevant. How many people you educated, how many people you cured, that was the important. So American philanthropy always has been respected abroad. And we have to keep internationally also the integrity of American philanthropy, so it does not get politicized completely, and it serves the kind of purpose we have.
Well, that gets us to a very interesting point, and I wanted to engage Doug and Sterling and others on this. All of us operate internationally, and when we think about the sensitivities and complexities of politics and public policy in the domestic context of the United States, it gets even far more complex for the reasons and others that you've pointed out, Vartan. You know, I just got back, Sterling did too, by coincidence, from 10 days in South Africa, where our foundation has been involved since the early 1960s. And many of the South African NGOs that we are currently supporting are working on major issues of current public policy importance in their country. And every stop I made, I was urged to be more active as a leader in South Africa in helping them get the message through to their political leadership about the lessons they're learning, the challenges they're facing, and the needs in the public policy realm. That gets very tricky. I mean, who are we as Americans to come rushing in and think we have the answers, or to be the facilitators? Doug, how do you approach this, and Sterling, others?
Well, of that 1.4 million nonprofit organizations, only about 2% are involved in what they call an international mission. We're one of those. The Asia Foundation works exclusively in Asia. We've been doing it for 51 years. In some cases, we've been working with Islamic organizations, for example, for over 35 years in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. So frankly, we have more credibility than the US government or anyone else. We have been concerned as a group of organizations about the Treasury regulations, the anti-terrorist regulations that have been under formulation, and now they're issued as guidelines. And the organizations together have looked at this very carefully and said we have about 5 major areas of objections. One of them is that we are not an agent of the US government. We cannot be conceived that, or our credibility is gone, and our effectiveness is damaged. Mm-hmm. Beyond all that, what we've been doing, and many others have been doing in parts of the world, is really public diplomacy. And at a time when America certainly needs an effective public diplomacy, it is through its NGOs in large part that it's going to be performed and restored. And so we are concerned about that direction. We certainly have no concern about the impact, about the goals of the anti-terrorist legislation, but the guidelines will soon be accepted by other agencies, and they'll become something other than guidelines unless there's a retreat and a move to something that is more workable and more positive for the country, and enables the NGO community to do its work that only it can do in some instances. So I hope I've answered your immediate question. But
so I assume, Doug, that when you're working throughout Asia, that as the foundation president and your predecessors and your staff, that you actually spend a lot of time with policymakers in those countries?
Yes, we do, but we only work with Asian partners, and we only work on mutually shared goals. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that we work through those Asian partners reassures them that it's not a policy that is formulated in Washington that drives our work. And now the fact that we receive funds from a much broader variety of donors, including development agencies from 7 or 8 other countries and 3 international organizations, means that we're not seen as so dependent upon USAID funds, while it's still the largest area. But working mostly at the grassroots, doing it always, however, with complete transparency with the government leaders in that country. Mm-hmm. So that today, despite the fact that the leadership of Vietnam is quite different than the energetic Vietnamese on the street, we have a very effective program there because they understand what we're doing, and we have mutual ends in mind, even for different reasons.
Sterling, what's your experience thus far in the international?
as far as I could tell from the program, ours was the only session that had the word politics in the title. Policy appeared in many others. So, but I think we may already coming up with a narrow definition of what is politics. We have access, as Doug just said, we probably all have access to the highest level officials anywhere we go because we're foundation presidents. But that, I would say, and that's politics in a way, just visiting and relationship building, and I'm learning a lot of this from my wife, but I had a day when I started in the morning in Lilongwe in Malawi and met with the Minister of Internal Security and Home Affairs, a woman minister who's in charge of all the police in the country of Malawi. Now, again, what is politics and why was I there? You know, we also, in our world where all of us are working in other countries, we're in a policy context where there might be bad policies, there might be no policies, there might be emerging policies which could go either way, and there might be perfectly wonderful policies. In Malawi, when I arrived, we didn't go there with this agenda, this issue. They have a gender-based violence policy at the national level. They're working on gender-based violence. They are interested in community policing, stuff that would have been domestically done in this country decades ago, maybe. So I meet with the minister, and then half an hour later, I'm meeting with the police chief. And later, I'm in a small village where the chief is talking to me about gender-based violence. And we're building police stations that have victim support places and people for women and children, and also men to stay. We didn't go to Africa to talk about gender-based violence. We were supposedly about rural poverty. But it's interesting to start with the minister and end with the tribal chief and meet a victim. And ask, am I doing politics here? I mean, there I felt like, and the minister said to me as I was leaving, I wish you'd do one of these in my village. You know, she was probably politicking me in a way. But later in the visit, we met with the king of Lesotho, or the CEO of Sanlam, one of the biggest financial institutions in South Africa and in Africa. And today I'm at Micro Enterprise Briefing, and I'm thinking, he was the former president of the University of Pretoria. He now runs a financial institution. He was a grantee of ours. As is the deputy president in South Africa. You know, they're our friends. We have relationships with them. To me, this is the kind of politics we should be doing all the time, which is raising the issues we care about with people that we've taken the time to build relationships with. And I must say also, I'm glad my staff briefed me, because I'm guessing that some of your favorite NGOs are helping to polarize situations in some of the places you're trying to be effective. And my staff said to me, don't say NGO. It's a bad word around here. It's seen as anti-government, outsiders, and so when a young fellow with a camera was doing taping for the nightly news show, got up to me and says, who are you working with? Thank God my staff I said, we're working with communities, we're working with villages, we're working with people. Mr. Kellogg said, help people help themselves. I didn't rattle off an NGO I was working with. So I think some of our best friends and grantees may be polarizing because they've had to fight the bad policy, they've gone to the barricades, but it means we have to overcome that in a different kind of politics sometimes to be effective.
Let me just mention, South Africa is a great point, so is Russia. We've been involved them as co-equals. Our aim was to support higher education in Russia. We're supporting 12 institutions of higher education, and we did this right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We did not want Soviet scientists, post-Soviet Union scientists, educators, and others to abandon 80 years of investment in universities and bring this taste for democracy and be alienated from. So we decided to support 12 provincial universities, regional universities. But we did it in cooperation with the Russian Ministry of Education. So that we're not outsiders, we're joint plan. And we did it with Russians in charge, with Americans here in Washington cooperating. Same thing in South Africa. South Africa, we've been there, my goodness, since many studies, but I'll come there. We were very active in anti-apartheid. So we have high credibility. Carnegie's name has high credibility in South Africa. We decided that we're going to support higher education in South Africa. But there's not enough money to keep all South African higher education institutions alive and active and excellent. But there's not political will to bring all of them, make all of them mediocre. So we decided we are going to support X number. And we brought 5 other foundations now, 6 foundations are involved in maintaining African higher education. We did it again by saying, you set your ambitions, you set your goals, you set your priorities. We are partners, not donor agencies. Now, this is a simple thing, but it was a revolutionary statement for them. And we're going to measure you also, your progress, by your own milestones. And therefore, there cannot be said, you told us, one instance, East Germans built cement concrete buildings for Dar el-Salam in Tanzania. The buildings are cracking up because they were donor agency. They decided what to do. They did. We said, no, we're partners. But there is a danger, and I'll tell you, that local communities or government may use foreign assistance, us, in order to rationalize their policies, saying, after all, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers, and Packard, all of them have already passed the test. This is the right thing to do. So you have constantly to back and forth to be sure you're not being used as much as possible, but as little as effectively you can manage. Because it's a very, very dangerous area that if you side with the governments, you alienate intellectuals. If you side with the intellectuals, you may alienate government. So we're going, like I said, communities. We're investing in universities of Africa. And around that, one concrete thing we have accomplished that I'm proud, we brought bandwidth prices down by 300%. If this becomes Pan-African phenomenon, we'll do more than any other force has been able to create communication between universities, museums, intellectuals, scholars, and others. So they see the results also, and we attribute to them the leadership rather than us. I think part of the how we should resist paternalism is an issue. How we should empower them and give them ownership is very important.
Carol, go ahead.
I think someone on this panel just mentioned the diplomacy opportunity that we all have, and I think it's a responsibility for people in the room, to the extent we get engaged in country. For example, our work in Ethiopia, or some of the other countries that Sterling was just mentioned. You have an opportunity to open doors there on behalf of organizations and people in country that they don't have. And Vartan's right, you have to be careful that you're not used in the process or miscommunicate. But I think it has something to do with building sustainability over a long term, to open those doors for people to build the capacity in country, to use your own personal leadership and voice. Joan Platt is sitting here, and her husband Lou Platt was on our board for many years. He was CEO of HP. He died tragically early in life last September. But he went out as a member of our board to meet with leaders in Ethiopia and the health ministry and others, talking about family planning. And it really, you have personal power to open doors and to reinforce the people and needs in country, that it's great if you can use it.
It's absolutely true. I think there's maybe a bit of a paradox, however, which is, and I apply this to myself as well, that maybe we're more comfortable and more willing to engage with the political leadership internationally than we are at home. I suspect I spend less time in Washington, D.C. than I spend in Pretoria in South Africa. And maybe we ought to think about that for a minute. Because many of the issues we're working on at home need that same kind of interface and interaction with the policymakers in Congress and elsewhere. I want to open this up to the floor, so please, if you've got questions, gather them. I'm going to put one more question while you're doing that. There are microphones, and I will call on you in just a moment. One of the other themes that has been running through this very stimulating conference, and it was a theme that President Clinton also naturally reinforced in his own remarks, is the theme about entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. It's a natural connection. Much of the money that has been made that is now available for philanthropy was made through entrepreneurship. Many of the new ideas are being promoted and tested and developed and scaled up through very entrepreneurial activity by many of the people in this room and the people that you are partners with all across the globe. We represent sort of large, traditional, mainstream, older, sort of maybe a little backward institutions. And I'm wondering, is there a lesson to derive from all of this? President Clinton said, I took this down, that we should all be entrepreneurs, that we should have entrepreneurial partnerships, that we should adopt entrepreneurial practices. How can institutions like ours, these older, more traditional places, foundations, what a term, it's like on the bottom. How can we become more entrepreneurial? Should we become more entrepreneurial? No entrepreneurs on this panel?
Go ahead. I can do it.
Carol.
Yeah, I think, did someone ever define entrepreneur? But it has a lot to do with agility and constantly changing and crossing boundaries and looking for new solutions and not looking for new partners and alliances. And even though we're 41 years old, we're absolutely committed to that, including that tool chest that I was talking about, toolkit, in terms of from advocacy to program-related investments. We need the dialogue, though, and have barely benefited from the dialogue with individual donors. We need to reach out to that. We found that to be incredibly stimulating for us to not just work with staff foundations, but to meet with other families and to talk trustee to trustee. But definitely the new alliances, but it isn't just a factor of age or size.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Doug, did you want to add a comment on this?
Well, in addition to bringing in some very different, interesting people to the organization all the time, which I think should be a goal, in my own organization, the Asia Foundation, I set aside a significant block of money for competitive kind of proposals from the 18 country office directors that we have. I set aside this money for work, and then this competitive process gave us some very interesting proposals and programs in public diplomacy, and we're starting a second round of those.
So this is sort of an incentive for internal entrepreneurship, which
Yes,
is,
that's exactly right.
which is great. All right, now do we have some questions?
Just add one thing about entrepreneurship. Andrew Carnegie was the first entrepreneur.
We're going to get into a
He said,
Rockefeller versus Carnegie argument.
no. He said, when somebody is hungry, don't give him fish, give a fishing pole. And we believed in that tradition in our entire philanthropy, how to empower people, not make them dependent. And that, I think, is the best form of entrepreneurship.
Great. Now, questions on the floor? Is there a question here? Yes. Okay, good. And would just identify yourself, if you would, as you introduce your question.
President Clinton talked about taking risk. Entrepreneurs take risk. In your own organizations, how do you look at when you decide what to do, how much risk you're willing to take? And I think there was a Thomas Watson quote about if you want to double your returns, you have to increase dramatically the number of failures that you have. So that mentality works well in Silicon Valley. How does it work in interacting with larger institutions?
Thank you very much. That I think is a question we have to have in our minds every day. And I can recall at my first appearance at the very first Global Philanthropy Forum 5 years ago, as a very new foundation president, we had a really challenging discussion about whether we're taking enough risk. And I think President Clinton challenged us to this again today. We have to be the risk capital of new social ideas. It's not going to come from any other source. It's not going to come from government. Business is only going to do so much in the social realm and not enough. We have to be the risk capital and the risk takers. And he's right. We have to fail sometimes and admit it and talk about it and get on top of it and move forward. Do you all agree? Are we taking enough risk?
Risk is not risk unless you confess mistakes. Most foundations are not psychologically, sociologically, legally, administratively ready to concede big mistakes. Otherwise, risk becomes something abstract, an abstraction. We have to be able every year in our reports to the public to say, we have failed in the following 2-3 projects, as President Clinton mentioned. Please, please, those of you who are entering this field, don't do it or go into it with full knowledge. One example I can mention that my colleagues cringed when I mentioned this. Several foundations, including Ford and us, invest lots of money for Constitutional Commission of Zimbabwe. It was utterly wasted. Complete waste. Now, one day they may revive it. I'm not saying for knowledge it was wasted, but the timing was wrong. And we should confess it. We've invested lots in education. There have been failures. We should confess it. Unless we confess failure, risk is not relevant argument.
Religion has been a big theme in this conference, and now we're going to confession as well. There's a question over here.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Quigley from the National Peace Corps Association, and I wanted to pick up on the thread that Doug Bereuter introduced about diplomacy. And I heard two different answers, one about public diplomacy, and then Carol talked about kind of a personal diplomacy, and Stephen did as well. And given the kind of the thrust related to the U.S. government on public diplomacy and the precipitous decline in attitudes about the U.S. tracked over the last decade, and I'm just curious about what kind of challenges and strategies to deal with those challenges related to diplomacy that some of you have come up with, because I think that would have applications broadly to the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug.
I noted after 9/11 there were 7 separate commissions, task force, high level, that looked at issues related to public diplomacy. All of them had a common conclusion, and that is that the most effective public diplomacy is conducted by non-governmental organizations and by the special skills of the private sector and by Americans in their interaction with people living abroad.
I would like to pick up on something that we heard from the data people today about sort of the next round of challenges is to build the deep support in this country for international work and international needs. And it does seem, I mean, one of the things that I think is so important about so many foundations working in so many countries is we do present another face. People to people, program to program, issue to issue, government to government, nonprofit to nonprofit, than whatever the power structure is in the United States at the time. But I am worried that with mother of 2 young daughters, 14 and 11, you know, how little our kids have bought into or been taught about or think internationally, let alone our college-age kids. And I'm just very excited about the efforts of DATA and Oxfam and ONE and Bono. I mean, but it is where we need to go in terms of, in the longer, intermediate to longer term, making sure that we have a different face to the world.
Absolutely. I think there's a question in the corner back here. Please stand up so they can find you with the microphone.
Hello, my name's Caroline Hartnell from Alliance magazine. I wanted to go back to the issue of the conservative foundations defining the issues facing the country and the solutions. I can understand the response that the mainstream and progressive foundations more believe in a marketplace of ideas. There are many faceted solutions. It's, you know, a more civilized approach, but you know, doesn't that leave a vacuum on the other side? And if you're, for instance, women who could imaginably find themselves faced without a choice of being able to have an abortion, you know, aren't their foundations have some responsibility if a war of ideas is being waged on one side to pick up and wage the other side too?
Thank you very much.
Can we go?
Well, I think,
go ahead.
as a foundation who's been engaged in that issue for a long time, I think that some of the key strands about funding over long run core support, funding innovation within our anchor organizations, trying to find new alliances and partnerships, new voices for those issues, that if those are characteristics of sort of long-term conservative investment, that's certainly where a handful of foundations and more, I hope, increasingly are doing on this particular set of issues. I really do think that in terms of funding both think tanks and new alliances and strategic communications and organizing efforts and advocacy efforts, we do need to unite around that, and we are, and it's a long-term effort.
I agree wholeheartedly with Carol on this. We have been involved in this, not nationally, but also internationally, because women's rights in Muslim countries or traditional other societies and so forth, human rights of immigrants here, so forth, we're all involved in those. The issue is whether there's, again, coming back what I said, one solution or not. We're not saying choice has many sides. Choice is legal, is part of women's rights now, and therefore it should be supported as a legal right, not just moral issue, but legal right. But there are also issues of human rights about Darfur and so forth. We have been involved now for the last 30 years in human rights defending wherever they are, the rights of immigrants in this country, human rights in Darfur, human rights in Bosnia, human rights in China, human rights in Tibet, wherever there have been human rights violations, we have been actively involved because we consider rights as indivisible, human dignity an indivisible phenomena, not to be divided along geographic other lines. The other thing which President Clinton did not mention, I just want to say the only thing he forgot to mention, in all fairness, because he stole our speeches, all of us had prepared something different to tell you, was the fact that you can't just have international solutions for problems without also understanding the religion, the culture, history of societies you deal with. And Doug is right. I'm so appalled that only 2% of American foundations are involved in international affairs. 2%. And so I feel that we have to increase, hopefully, the number of all of you who were convinced by the president that issues are interdependent and universal, including about choice, including human rights, environment, and political rights, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and democracy. These are universal norms, and we should not be segregated.
We come to some conclusions about things that we stand for, stand with, including our grantees. And it's there that I think we need to stand up and be counted and be more vocal and shine the spotlight on the grantees, give them the microphone, and be there to say, this is what we've learned, this is what's right, and this is what we believe in. And I don't think it has to be ideological. It can be, in fact, research-based, pragmatic, tested, modeled. But once we get to the point where we think we've learned something, then let's stand for it and let's fight for it. There's a question here.
I'm pretty loud.
They're coming. They're coming.
The tape is.
Thanks. Is this better? My name's Anat, and I work at a progressive think tank in Berkeley where we do framing of political discourse, so now you know my bias. A comment and then a question. A fishing pole is, after all, just a walking stick if you don't have a pond to fish in, and if the fish in the pond have mercury in them. So it's kind of there's a context needed before self-sufficiency is really achievable. And then I guess in your comments, several of you talked about thinking as a sector, and I think something that we need to reckon ourselves with as a sector, and I also work at a nonprofit, is the fact that we do receive tax-deductible contributions, thereby defraying some measure of what goes into the tax stream. And as a person who works at a progressive organization, and all of you that work at foundations, I think we need to recognize that the act of giving money is itself a political act, because that money would otherwise be going into the tax stream and government would be making decisions about how to allocate it. And by making decisions about how to allocate those resources, you in fact are making political decisions.
And
Doug?
That's right. That's right. And I'm glad you look at it that way.
And as part of that, the particular vibrancy and importance of this sector is that those political decisions can be all over the map in terms, and that's our duty, is to have an independent voice, independent from each other and independent from government and others. But I do think it does come with a responsibility. And that's true for family foundations, it's true for large private independent foundations, it's true for corporate foundations. And those words have been mentioned here too, and it's transparency, and a real focus on effectiveness to use them well.
I think we only have time for a final question, please.
Comment also. I'm Ron Layton from Lightyears IP, and IP stands for intellectual property, which the gentleman from Silicon Valley will know about. And I'm thinking about Andrew Carnegie in this time period. If he was born today, if he was an entrepreneur today, he would add a third line to that. I was with 25 LDC trade ministers, and I was putting forward our view that there's a very large amount that is not of the world economy that is not related to production. And it's related to intangible values, intellectual property. That's where the entrepreneur of today makes his money. And so I said to them, production is dead. And they stood up and cheered, because they damn well know that. And so it wouldn't be to give a man a fish. It wouldn't give him a fishing pole. It would be to tell him how to negotiate a fishing license.
I'd like to just to make one point. Unfortunately, we're entering a very cynical age. Andrew Carnegie did not give his money in order to get tax exemption. That was before tax laws. His prenuptial agreement was 8 lines. Dear wife, I'm going to give all my money away, philanthropy. And he said, thank you, I agree with you. Whether somebody gives money out of vanity and so forth, so on, it's fine. The other thing, they don't have to give. Rich men can spend buying things, be best American consumer. So the fact that somebody chooses to invest in philanthropy, good. I see it's socially good. And our society has reached such a sophisticated age that even our politicians, when they run for presidential office, have publicly to say and defend how charitable they are. That's a remarkable thing. No other country, Blair has to get up in rich parliament and say, my donation this year was this much, or Chirac saying this much, or in Norway saying this much, and so forth. As a matter of fact, one of the differences I was telling to my colleagues between Mexico, where I just came from, talking to Mexican philanthropists, they consider charity belonging to the church, philanthropy belonging to the state. They don't trust non-governmental agencies because they may be anti-state. And I had never encountered this argument, that state by definition is to be philanthropic because it cares for the welfare of the people, whereas individuals have to take care of welfare of individuals. So in many ways, yes, they get tax benefit. Everything has been supported by decision of government and the public, how to allow us to distribute money. But at the same time, it's important that Gates, somebody else, instead of building castles all over the world, has decided to invest money into eliminating diseases, combating poverty, or promoting education. So we should not be always defensive about one of the major contributions of America since its founding days, namely volunteerism, public service, and philanthropy.
Would you all do 2 things for me? I would like to have you thank our really superb panel, and I would like you to thank Jane Wales and her team for organizing another fantastic Global Philanthropy Forum.